As I shared in my in the prior section of the presentation, I don't purport to be an expert on ports. I've had the benefit of working in coastal communities, including here in Carteret County, where I have worked with our ports staff as well as a local support community. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time trying to tell you about things that you know a lot more about than I do. So I do want to just share a little bit of my perspective on the important roles that ports do play in economic development. And I've identified four roles specifically, and there are probably many more, but this is what I want to talk briefly about in my remarks today. I want to talk about, for port communities, the important role that ports play in your home area, and that can't be overstated. I mean, ports are tremendous assets in the communities where they exist. I want to talk about the important role that ports play in site location decisions and how ports can be an important asset in attracting outside investment and job creation. I'll talk briefly again about exports and the increasing role that exporting is playing in our global economy. Again, I'm not an expert in exports, but I will touch on that briefly. Same thing with the essential mission critical role that ports play, arguably the most important role that ports play in the global supply chain. Home community impacts. Even in a small community like Carteret County, North Carolina, where we have a niche bulk and break bulk port, the port is a very important economic engine. We probably have less than 5 million short tons of cargo that is handled through this port. So it is just a bit player in comparison to many of your ports or ports where you will be employed that have hundreds of millions of tons of cargo that move through your port each year. In North Carolina, we have a much larger port in Wilmington, also very adversely impacted by the recent hurricane, which is where our container terminal resides. It plays a much larger role in the regional economy in New Hanover County and around the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, than the port of Morehead City plays here. But nonetheless, it's a very, very important asset in our local community. And the way that ports benefit your local community is multifaceted. Obviously, the port enterprise itself is a large employer. In most cases, though, the employment directly related to the state ports or the port authority that is the port operator is much smaller than the other activities and the other employment that are generated by your customers and the other people who are your partners at your port facilities, whether it's pilots and towing companies or the railroads and many others that are involved in freight movements and customs and other activities at your port. These are often jobs that are highly skilled jobs. They have higher wages. They have good benefits. In most communities, the longshoremen are unionized and have a very good wage and benefit structure. In the communities where you still have non-union port workers, nonetheless, they're very highly skilled and well compensated. And in a county like ours, which is predominated by sort of tourism-related industries and occupations which tend to pay at the lower end of the wage spectrum, having these highly skilled jobs is incredibly important in our community. So beyond just the direct wages that are earned by the workers who work at the ports, there are many other economic benefits. One hears a great deal about the multiplier effect of employment in a local area, and certainly in the case of the port-related employment, that is a very important component of the total economic impact of the port, so that the monies that are earned by the port workers, the port employees, and those who are working with your customers at the port is expended locally on everything from homes to retail purchases, and then those dollars have a ripple effect through the community. So when you begin to look at the direct and the indirect and what's called the induced impacts of the wages, they are very, very significant. And it's important for your communities to quantify that, because it's an important part of the story you need to tell, particularly when you're seeking support for new investments and infrastructure at your port facilities. And very importantly, even though often the ports are publicly owned and aren't directly paying property taxes, the spinoff activities from the ports and the equipment and machinery that are owned by your customers are taxed. So you're generating a lot of tax revenues for your local and state governments, as well as the income taxes that are paid to your state governments, your federal government, and in some cases in larger municipalities, your local governments as well. So, these are huge economic impacts, and again, you need to be talking about that at every opportunity that you can. And then finally, I talked about raising the brand awareness of a community. In economic development, we're always trying to be seen and be visible and sort of stand out among the crowd. And not only by having a port, do you have a differentiating advantage and an asset in a lot of your economic development activities related to business attraction. It also raises the visibility of your community. I mean, we know a lot more about Savannah, Georgia, because of the port of Savannah than we would in the absence of a port there. And even in the case of Morehead City, North Carolina, it has certainly been an asset that has helped us raise our community brand awareness. Site location decisions are enormously complex, and there are a lot of consultants that are in the business of advising companies on where to locate their facilities. For many companies, certainly not all, but for many companies, proximity to a port is a very important site location factor that influences where a company will choose to locate or expand or relocate, and that's true of domestic and international companies. So often, particularly around container ports, larger container ports, we've seen a huge investment of 3PLs and manufacturing companies investing in million square foot distribution centers and others because of the proximity that those distribution centers have to a port, both for importing and exporting purposes. So this, again, is a huge differentiating advantage in the economic development competition for new businesses to have a port. It's less important for us in this community because our small port here is a bulk and break bulk port, but certainly in areas that have large container facilities, it drives a tremendous amount of new investment and job creation. I don't know a great deal about inland ports. I haven't worked with them directly, but I think with the evolution of inland ports, you have many of the same advantages of having the logistics benefits and the cost savings in terms of freight shipments by rail and truck to the inland port that are driving a lot of investment by the private sector in areas that are home to inland ports as well. And again, this is an important asset in attracting both foreign direct investment as well as domestic investment as well. I found some data in looking at doing some port research that indicates that by volume, over 70% of international cargo shipments are by sea, and although some high-value goods, I think, are still shipped by air, there's no question that ports are the most important piece of the export equation for United States companies. And I've talked a little bit about traded sectors here, and I just want to take a minute and explain what that is. You hear it a lot in economic development conversations, and traded sectors are basically those sectors of the economy where goods are produced and sold outside of the community where they are manufactured. And this is actually has historically been kind of the major way that communities grow and increase their wealth, is by creating products that are sold outside of the local market and attracting new dollars into that local community that catalyzes economic activity and new investment. I think historically we've talked about traded sectors primarily in a manufacturing context. As I said, the manufacture of goods that are sold outside of the local market. But increasingly, I think people are understanding the important role that traded sectors play in exports. So it's exporting products, driving new investment or the sale of those products in international markets. Again, trying to drive those dollars back into U.S. markets and into the communities where the goods that are exported are being manufactured. We're seeing this now on a global stage, and exporting is becoming a very important source of revenue. It's interesting, even though we've talked a lot about traded sectors in the context of manufacturing and even exporting, even areas like tourism and even retirement are areas that can be seen as traded sectors because they're bringing in a tremendous amount of dollars from outside of the market into that local market. So when you think about traded sectors, while the emphasis has historically been on manufacturing and sales beyond the local market, increasingly I think that term is being used to apply to other sectors of the economy as well. Obviously, the more products that companies can sell through exports and international markets, the more revenues, the more profits are generated. That drives additional job creation, new capital investment expansions, new capital investments in new facilities and new markets. So the role that ports play in this cannot be overemphasized. Again, well, I'll speak to imports. I mean, any international trade certainly drives a tremendous amount of economic activity. Exports get a disproportionate focus, again, because they are traded sectors and result in new revenues coming into the United States, into our domestic companies and through your ports. But obviously, your import activities drive a great deal of revenues as well. But it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in the sense that if we're importing goods, then our dollars, our consumer dollars that are being expended on those goods are actually going to other places and leaving the U.S. But again, exports and the role of the ports in exports can't really be overstated as an increasingly important part of our global economy. I'm not an expert in supply chains, but again, if 70% or more of our cargo is moving by sea, ports are the most critical element in global supply chains. And even though there's a big push now for sort of a U.S.-focused agenda, we are in a global economy. That ship has sailed, and our businesses are going to continue to want to grow their international presence and international trade, and your ports are going to be at the center of that activity. And any disruptions in those supply chains can be crippling, even bankrupting to your customer businesses. So, again, as you begin to talk about, and we'll get to this in a few moments in my concluding slides, when you begin to talk about the importance of your ports in commerce and economic development, you have an education challenge to make your stakeholders and the general public and your legislative leaders more aware of how global supply chains work and the role that your ports will play and do play in the movement of goods globally, and that in turn drives jobs in the home state and the home communities. And again, I think ports are probably the most important element in these global supply chains. So I'm going to conclude this section of my remarks, and then come back with two more slides, just sharing a few observations and hopefully a few important takeaways and recommendations that will benefit you once you resume your careers in port management. Thank you.